Welcome back to Legal Principles of Surveying, where today we're going to talk about histories and roles of boundaries. We're going to finish up Chapter 1 from Brown's Legal Boundary Controls, and then we're going to start talking about Chapter 2. This is Legal Principles of Surveying, Spring 2014 online. This is Chris Riles, your instructor from East Central Community College in Decatur, Mississippi. A few things about the slides that we've been using. The slides can cover the main points of the chapter, but you still need to read the chapter for details. There's a lot of information in the chapter that I'm hoping you will read. Both the slides and the chapter readings will be used for exams and quizzes, so it's important that you highlight details from the chapter that are mentioned in the slides and that you read through those. Any underlined words in the slides or paragraphs are very important to the lecture topic, so you may need a dictionary to help you with some of these topics and words as we continue on talking about the legal aspects of surveying. Boundaries in history. The location and determination of boundaries has been a subject of arguments and wars throughout the history of the world. Many wars erupted from just the concept of whose boundary is where. And the surveyor may actually be implicated as a cause of some of these boundary issues. And it really comes back to methodologies, erroneous data, maps, and other information. And that can very well cause a huge argument. And as we well know, boundaries are very important to the individuals who own the property. There are three categories of boundary creation. We have action, writings, and law. Now, all boundaries are created within these categories, so it's either going to be done by a physical marker, a corner, a fence, a marker on the ground. Writings, which would be deeds, descriptions of the land, something that's describing the location of the land, and then just by a law statute, whether it be by common law, modern statutes, or some precedents. Some commonly used legal terms that you'll see throughout this course and all legal documents that you may come across while surveying are property, rights, interests, and title. And a dictionary can help you understand these some. I'm going to try to give you a brief overview of each one of these, but I would encourage you to dig deeper. Property by definition is anything that is owned by a person, group of persons, or an entity. Property relating to land is called real property. So when we work with property, we're really talking about real property when it comes to land. The common term for property refers to the extents of ownership defined by boundaries. So you'll hear people refer to their lands as their property. While this is a true statement, in this course, try to think of property being anything that is or can be owned by a person. It's really important to think of it as something that can be owned. The term for property line should be referred to as boundaries, however, because we're trying to stay within that verbiage of boundaries. Now, there are several rights to property that are mentioned in your book. If you look in your book in Chapter 2, it talks about the rights to property. These stem from English common law. And English common law, of course, came over with us from England. And it gives the owner of the property certain rights to their ownership and their ability to change and modify their property as they see fit. These are the right to dispose of property not inconsistent with the law, the right to have land free from interference, which means you don't want anyone to bother you with the land that you have, right to support of property, right to use the waters that flow through or on property, right to any waters that flow through or touch the property, and right to all the space above and below surface boundary lines. And this one's pretty important, pretty interesting. The parcel of land that you own, let's say it's a 1 acre parcel, that 1 acre parcel you own all the way into the heavens, according to common law, and all the way to the depths of the earth. So basically you own everything within that square up and down. Well, the cool thing about that is you can build something as tall as you want to as long as it doesn't interfere with the rights of other people. And so the concept here is you have the right to your property and to use it any way you see fit as long as it doesn't infringe on the rights of other people. You have right to possess property, and you have the right to convey or gift the property to second parties if you so will. An interest in property is a right that can be defined or transferred. So for instance, when a property is mortgaged, the bank has an interest in the land. Now, their interest is defined by a contract that's signed by the owner. The bank does not own the land. In the event that the mortgage is paid and everybody's paying their bills, the bank doesn't own the land. However, once the contract is voided, if it's not met, the bank can then possess and have title to the land. And that's how we work with interest. Other forms of interest might be mineral rights, timber rights, improvement rights, etc. But really, The one that we see the most is mineral and timber rights in this region of the country. You will see a lot of mineral rights as deeds of trust or mineral rights deeds, oil and gas leases. You will see these whenever you go to the courthouse and look up information on deeds. You'll see these, and these are interests in property. The people who have the rights, the mineral rights, they don't own the property, but they do own an interest in the property. Title of property. Basically, title is the ownership of real property. It stands against the right of anyone else to claim the real property, which basically says it's the proof of ownership to stop anyone from claiming ownership. Now, if you have a deed to your property, that does not mean that you own the land. Deeds are evidence of title, but a deed alone does not prove ownership. You can't say that because I have a deed to something I own it. That's not legal. It's nothing but evidence of ownership. Now, you should have several things of evidence. You should have evidence of paying your taxes, evidence of where your home is, or where you've done improvements to the land, evidence of things that you have taken care of the land over a period of time, along with your deed. There should be evidence of some kind. Deeds should have legal descriptions on the property that define the boundaries of the property. However, this still does not prove or ensure ownership. Just because you have a deed that says you own 20 acres in the southwest quarter of a section does not necessarily mean that you own that southwest quarter of the section. The defined corners on the ground are seen by the courts as more evidence of ownership. What's on the ground is what's actually there. It's really what's defined. Boundaries are, what are boundaries? They are basically the separation of property interest. So basically, we talked about interest just a minute ago. Interests are things that I can own or have ownership of, but it's not necessarily ownership of the property. Boundaries separate these interests or these rights that I have as well. The subject of many wars and conflicts throughout recorded history are boundaries, because where's the line? Where do we own things? In the book, it says that people take their boundaries seriously, and this is very, very true. In many cases, a conflict arises because of unsure or underdefined boundary location, and this is apparent in many different ways. I was on a survey in Leake County a few years ago where we had an individual who claimed that he owned this land that was fenced in. Well, according to what we found and according to the understanding of the people that we were working with, he did not. He was very adamant about the fact and even was willing to take force against us coming down there and surveying the property. We had to go back, do our research, and investigate more, and eventually had to let someone else handle the situation. Boundaries do not determine rights in land, but they define the limits of any rights. If I have a right to property, a boundary does not determine that right, but rather a boundary defines the extent of the right, the limits of the right. So there's 10 boundary principles in your book. Boundary principle number 1, boundaries have a long history in the world. Principle number 2, surveyors create land boundaries. Principle 3, closed boundaries identify claim through a claim of title. Principle 4, land can only be conveyed by quality and quantity by which an individual has title. Principle 5, in most cases, federal law is not used to describe real property rights. Principle 6, real property rights are described by laws based on the particular location of the property. Principle 7, once boundary lines are created, they may be changed by law or actions of landowners who have vested rights. Principle 8, law does not allow for two original descriptions of the same parcel. Principle 9, multiple boundary descriptions may exist for the same parcel, but only one controls. And Principle 10, there may only be one original boundary survey and description. All others are considered to be what we call retracements. So, let's talk about Principle 2 just a little bit. Surveyors create land boundaries. This can be performed by surveys on property. These boundaries are created by what's called a retracement survey. Now, I had some questions about what retracements were throughout the week, and I really appreciate you guys asking me questions. Part of this learning process is asking questions, so I really do appreciate that. Original surveys are surveys performed before the land was owned by anybody. So this was before it was owned by the U.S. government, before it was owned by anybody. It was surveyed originally. In early U.S. history, land that was not surveyed was considered to be public domain until it was surveyed and then conveyed to individuals or entities by what we call a patent. The lands that we live in central Mississippi were surveyed in the 1830s, between 1832 and around 1838. And depending on how far south you are, the earlier you were surveyed. These are what we call original surveys. They set up the townships and the sections, and this is what founded our country through the public land survey system. Retracement surveys are all other surveys that are performed after the original surveys. Today, these commonly referred to land partition or a boundary survey. Okay, it could be either one of those. Closed boundaries identify claim. Talking about principle 3. These closed boundaries, commonly called parcels, are imaginary lines defined by corners. These corners are the physical representation of the boundary. And I want you to think about corners being something that's on the ground, or it's defined by imaginary lines, and a monument being something on the ground, something that's in the dirt. Until some physical option is constructed, fences, walls, canals, boundary lines remain unmarked. This causes the locations of boundary corners to become very, very, very important to both the surveyor and the court system. Many disputes arise when corners are quote-unquote lost, destroyed, or when boundaries become vague. Many boundary disputes can be corrected by using proper methods and having reasonable clients involved. Remember that boundaries are very, very important to people. In some cases, this has been recorded that it has been recorded that a dispute could not be corrected until an individual was deceased. This is not always the case, but could occur. I have known of instances where there were problems between two landowners, and until one of the landowners either sold their land or was deceased, the problem still occurred. Making a dedicated search for evidence, and when I say dedicated, I mean really, really focused search for evidence, both in the field and in the local courthouse. That's really the role of the surveyor. It's important as a surveyor to really be looking for the truth. We're investigating and looking for the truth. We want the truth to come out. And we must make every effort to make the most informed decision when dealing with people's boundaries. Because just like a doctor or a lawyer, we're working with people's livelihood. And it's important to take it very seriously and take evidence seriously. It's not something to be played with or to be slack and lack about. It's really important to be focused when we look for evidence. That's just kind of my soapbox when it comes to evidence. So what makes up a boundary? Continuing with principle 3. Corners make up a boundary. They're marked by either man-made or natural monumentation. Some monuments may not be physically present due to their passage of time or prior destruction. Corners are located on a map. Monuments are on the ground. Remember that. Measurements. Some of the most important work in surveying is related to distance and direction measurement. Legal descriptions use calls for distance and direction to describe the layout of the boundary. So many feet to the northwest direction, and that's really important when it comes to reading a legal description, understanding the different parts of a legal description. And then we have bounds. These may be natural or man-made features that cross or follow boundaries, roads, streams, state lines, etc. Now this is a really good quote from the textbook, and I want you to take this in. This is a very, very good quote. In this book, it's assumed that surveyors possess the mechanical measurement skills that are necessary and essential to create and locate boundaries correctly. Yet, today's modern technological world, new areas are evolving in which the student must become familiar, for example, with geographic information systems, GPS units, and many other areas of pseudo-measurement that some wish to substitute for measurements. The importance behind this is that Google Maps is not a reliable data source. You don't want to get your data from Google Maps. You just don't want to do that. That's not going to work out well for you. You really want to make sure that your data comes from a valid source, and you can't use internet sources as your only source of data. You can't survey something without going out on the ground and looking. You can't do it from a map. You can't do it from your computer. Many people today wish to substitute measurements on the ground for measurements using GIS, GPS, and we have a lot of technologies that are very, very good. But you cannot replace the original method of walking out there and searching for boundaries. That's just irreplaceable. A little bit about description of boundaries. Boundaries are defined by corners and then measured for distance and direction. Descriptions of these boundaries are made of words that have importance in describing the real property. Language, precise measurements, corner descriptions, and locational information are in deeds of the property. Even though deeds are not proof of ownership, they are a source of very important evidence. And it is important to have your deed, have a copy of your deed somewhere, and also just read it every now and then. Just have a look at what it actually says. It's important as a surveyor to be careful how features and boundaries are described. Many conflicts and problems have arisen out of people just going out there and performing a survey and not really focusing on how it's then described and put on the map. The collection of data must also be done with great focus and care. Remember, this is somebody else's property that we're dealing with, and we want to make sure that we do a good job in managing their property and managing the survey in its whole, in its entirety. In addition to a boundary call, a surveyor is also responsible for locating the limits of possession, locating the limits of the claim of ownership, which is not necessarily the true boundary. In the instance with the individual from Leake County, he claimed he owned a different part of property than he actually did, but it's important that we locate those limits. Locating improvements on the property, fences, buildings, pavement, anything that improves the value of the property. And then locating and describing the rights and interests in land. It's really important that we locate those lines, those boundaries, so that we know where the rights and interests in the land start and end. Pursuing evidence requires a method called following the footsteps of former surveyors, perhaps back even to an original survey. And this is important when it comes to dealing with any land in Mississippi and many of the states in the U.S., where we want to go all the way back to an original survey as far as we possibly can to determine how the land was moved and sold and predicated, so that we can then know the future of the land based on what we know currently today and what exists today. So let's talk a little bit about original surveys. Excuse me. The concept of original surveys relies on the following. It's the first survey on any land performed by the Bureau of Land Management. At the time, it was called the General Land Office. These are also legally unchangeable, no matter the errors or miscalculations. If you follow this court case here, this is Cragen versus the U.S., you will see where there is a concept of the court case there that says, look, the federal government surveys, even if they were done poorly, they're still federal government surveys, and they're still the same. And we're not going to change those, because if you change those surveys, well, you're having to change then all the boundaries that are tied to those surveys. And we don't want to do that. That would cause a lot of headache and a lot of drama between many, many people. If you look at the picture that I've got here on the right, this is actually the original initial point, well, the initial point, not the original one, but the initial point at the 5th Principal Meridian near Stuttgart, Arkansas. It's a pretty cool place. You can go here. I went during the winter time there, and you could see the water's way down, but water usually covers half of this stone up. And the very top of the stone is a very large X, and that is the central point for the initial point for the 5th Principal Meridian. More on original surveys. The corners of original surveys stand regardless of error in location, if they can or cannot be found, any changes to surrounding parcels, and this ensures a solid basis for which all surveys are conducted. Surveys are required to be tied to an original PLSS survey in all PLSS states. For instance, I can't go out and do a survey and just say, well, here's the line. It has to be tied directly to a monument that is based off an original survey, whether it be a section corner, a township corner, any of those. This monument that you see here on your right is actually a picture of one of the markers at Ellicott Stone down near Mobile, Alabama. This is off of the St. Stephen's Meridian, and this stone was set in 1799. Now, a little bit about retracement surveys. We talked about original, now we're going to talk about retracement. Retracement is the process of following the footsteps of former surveyors when surveying a parcel. Unless you're a federal surveyor, all surveys that you will conduct are retracement surveys. It's important to know that you're going to be retracing a survey. You're not going to be doing an original survey. Even if you're a federal surveyor and you're surveying in Mississippi, they're all retracements, because there was an original survey back in the day, and there's not now. If we go up to parts of, let's say, Alaska that have not been surveyed yet, then you could there perform an original survey on land that had never been surveyed or owned by anyone before. This process of following a former surveyor will mean you have to conduct a great deal of research to find evidence of former surveys. And really, in Mississippi, because of the way the laws are, the evidence that you have at your disposal is mostly deeds. Now, you can talk to surveyors and get some plats and get some other information, but really you have deeds to go off of, and parole evidence is most of what you can gather. Retracement surveys fall under the guidelines of current state standards of surveying while holding to the concept that original surveys cannot be changed and are the basis of all retracements. So one of the questions that was proposed to me about retracement surveys, let's say that I have a 20-acre parcel and I want to take this 20-acre parcel and cut it up into 4-acre pieces. Well, I can do that. I can cut it up, but the lines that are created are not original lines because they come off of another line from the 20-acre parcel, and the 20-acre parcel comes off another line. And so at some point I'm going to have to go all the way back to the original, to a section corner, to a township corner. This means that all surveys conducted in lands that already have been surveyed are retracements. I have to go back and I have to do the research. I can't just say, well, I'm here and I did the survey and that's all I've got. I can't do that. It really comes down to the fact that it's all about evidence. A surveyor is responsible for following evidence to lead to a conclusion about the boundary's location. And I'm going to hammer this evidence thing throughout the semester, but really it's extremely important. The more evidence that you gather about the land, the better off you will be conducting the survey. Collecting deeds, legal descriptions of past and present property, and past and present title in property, and the surrounding property. You really want to look for anything and everything that you could possibly use with a survey. You want to walk the boundary line, searching for corners or evidence of physical boundaries, painted trees, flagging, fences, section corners, township corners, iron pipes. You want to do as much research as you possibly can to the area, and you also want to talk to the landowners, which is called parole evidence, about the boundaries and the locations. Many landowners know where their boundary lines are, or they know approximately where they are. And if they can take you in the woods and show you where a corner has been or was, well, that helps. That saves you a lot of time, and you don't have to do as much work. Searching for maps and other evidence from former or current surveyors in the area is another way. This is sometimes a futile effort because many surveyors may not share their information, but you can have a few that would share information with you about local surveys. Now, dealing with boundary principles 8 and 10. The law does not allow for two original descriptions in the same parcel, and 10, there can only be one original boundary and survey and description. All others are considered to be retracements. This means that there can only be one original survey. I can't stress enough the fact that original does not mean new. Original means was old, back in the day, old survey. And that all subsequent surveys are considered to be retracements of that original. There's no other way around it. This doctrine holds the modern surveyor to accept the original created boundaries and to follow them according to procured evidence, which means I have to follow the messed up older survey. There's no way around that. Field notes and plats of original surveys can be found at the General Land Office section of the Bureau of Land Management website. I didn't give you the link here, but you can go out to Google, type BLM GLO, two different acronyms, BLM space GLO, and you can bring up the BLM website. And for all the PLSS states, you can search original evidence, field notes, and plats. That is helpful, especially if you're doing a survey along a section line or dealing within intersections or looking for section corners, because he can actually give you more information about what was there originally. Now the problem is that 200 years have passed since these sections and townships were laid out, and so a lot has changed in those 200 years, but we need to continue to remember the fact that, hey, somebody was out here and set these original lines. We need to try to stay as true to the original as we possibly can. This ends the lecture on Chapter 1. We'll start lecturing about Chapter 2 in the next video. Hope you join us for that, and hope you have a great day.